Sketches of Slave Life by Peter Randolph, Chapters 4 and 5. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 4, Overseers. The first overseer I served under was Henry Hollingworth, a cruel and a bad man. He often whipped my mother and the children, and worked the slaves almost day and night, in all weather. The men had no comfort with their wives, for any of the latter who pleased him he would take from their husbands and use himself. If any refused his lewd embraces, he treated them with the utmost barbarity. At night he watched the slaves' huts to find out if they said anything against him, or had any food except what he had allowed them, and if he discovered anything he disliked they were severely whipped. He continued this conduct for about 3 years, when Mr. Edloe discovered it and discharged him. The next overseer, who lived on the plantation, did not treat the people so badly as did Hollingworth, but he drove them very hard, and watched them very closely to see that they took nothing but their allowance. He only lived there 2 years, when he was discharged for misconduct. The next overseer, a man named Harris, only remained about 6 months. His cruelty was so great it came to Mr. Edloe's ear, and he was discharged. The successor of Harris was L. Hobbs. He was very cruel to the people, especially to all women who would not submit to him. He used to bind women hand and foot, and whip them until the blood ran down to the earth, and then wash them down in salt and water, and keep them tied all day, when Edloe was not at home. He used to take my cousin and tie her up and whip her so she could not lie down to rest at night until her back got well. All this was done on Edloe's plantation, the good slaveholder who owned me; and the other slaveholders used to say to him that he spoiled his niggers. But this was the way he spoiled them. Hobbs continued this ill treatment for the space of 3 years, then he was turned off. Thus ends the history of Hobbs on Edloe's plantation, with the exception of leaving what are termed mulattoes in Virginia. The fifth overseer was B.F. Bishop. He came to the plantation as a tyrant, and proved himself such to men, women, and children. He reigned tyrannically for 1 year, and did many things which decency will not permit me to speak of. He and all of the overseers were in the habit of stealing from their employer, and the colored people knew it, but their informing Edloe would have done no good, for he could not believe a slave. According to the laws of Virginia, the testimony of a slave against an overseer could not be taken. This Benjamin Bishop reigned monarch of all he surveyed, doing as he chose in everything, cruel as cruel could be, 1 year, when he was discharged. The sixth overseer was R. Lacey, a native of Charles City, Virginia. He reigned 7 years. I cannot describe to my readers the malice and madness with which this being treated Edloe's slaves. You cannot find his parallel in history, except it be in Nero or Caligula. Indeed, he was a very wicked man and a hypocrite. I cannot point to one good deed he ever performed. He would enter the houses and bind men and women, and inflict torture upon them, whether innocent or guilty. The blood of innocent slaves is yet crying to the God of justice to avenge their sufferings, and pour out deserved judgment upon the head of Lacey. The seventh overseer was P. Vaughn. He was cruel, but not so much so as some of the others had been. He was too fond of rum and the females, so Edloe gave him his walking ticket. The eighth overseer was J. G. Harrison. He was with Mr. Edloe at the time of his decease. Harrison was, like others in his station, hard and unmerciful. He made his dogs tear and bite my mother very badly. She died soon after, and was freed from her tormentors, at rest from her labors, and rejoicing in heaven. This same Harrison shot one of Edloe's men, because he would not submit to the lash, but no one said anything to Harrison about his conduct. He did not kill the man. Although shot, he is now living in Charlestown, Massachusetts. His name is Wyatt Lee. He is well known in Boston. Food and clothing. I shall now show what the slaves have to eat and wear. They have 1 pair of shoes for the year. If these are worn out in 2 months, they get no more that year, but must go barefooted the rest of the year through cold and heat. The shoes are very poor ones, made by one of the slaves, and do not last more than 2 or 3 months. 1 pair of stockings is allowed them for the year. When these are gone, they have no more, although it is cold in Virginia for 5 months. They have 1 suit of clothes for the year. This is very poor indeed, and made by the slaves themselves on the plantation. It will not last more than 3 months, and then the poor slave gets no more from the slaveholder if he go naked. This suit consists of 1 shirt, 1 pair of pants, 1 pair of socks, 1 pair of shoes, and no vest at all. The slave has a hat given him once in 2 years. When this is worn out, he gets no more from the slaveholder, but must go bareheaded till he can get one somewhere else. Perhaps the slave will get him a skin of some kind, and make him a hat. The food of the slaves is this: every Saturday night they receive 2 pounds of bacon and 1 peck and a half of corn meal, to last the men through the week. The women have 1/2 pound of meat and 1 peck of meal, and the children 1/2 peck each. When this is gone, they can have no more till the end of the week. This is very little food for the slaves. They have to beg when they can. When they cannot, they must suffer. They are not allowed to go off the plantation. If they do, and are caught, they are whipped very severely, and what they have begged is taken from them. Chapter 5. Customs of the Slaves when one of their number dies. They go to the overseer and obtain leave to sit up all night with their dead, and sing and pray. This is a very solemn season. First one sings and another prays, and this they continue every night, until the dead body is buried. One of the slaves makes the coffin, and a very bad one it generally is. Some wheat straw is put in the coffin, and if they can get it, they wrap the body in a piece of white cloth. If they cannot get it, they put the body in the coffin without anything around it. Then they nail up the coffin and put it in a cart, which is drawn by oxen or mules, and carried to the grave. As they have no tombs, they put all the slaves in the earth. If the slave who died was a Christian, the rest of the Christians among them feel very glad, and thank God that Brother Charles, or Brother Ned, or Sister Betsy is at last free and gone home to heaven, where bondage is never known. Some, who are left behind, cry and grieve that they too cannot die, and throw off their yoke of slavery, and join the company of the brother or sister who has just gone. When the overseer is in good humor, he will let all the people go to look the last time upon their relative. If he is ill-tempered, he will not let the slaves go at all. So it all depends upon the state of mind the overseer is in, whether the child is permitted to look upon the remains of its parent, the husband upon his wife, the mother upon her child, or any other dear relative. Ah, my readers, think of this, and see the cruelty of the peculiar institution. Slaves have tender human feelings, very warm and tender they are. But it matters not how sorrowful and heavy a heart the poor negro may have, he cannot see his lifeless friends unless the slaveholder wills it. When several of the slaves die together, the others go to their owners and ask him to let them have a funeral. Most of the owners will grant their slaves this privilege. When the owner and overseer give their consent, the slaveholder sends a note to a white preacher. Then they set the day, and the slaves make ready for the funeral services over their friends. The slaves go to the woods and make seats to sit upon. This is done Saturday night. When the seats are prepared, they are left till the slaves take their seats upon them, and sit until about 10 o'clock, when the slave-holding minister comes and preaches about 1 hour and a half. Then he gives the negroes liberty to sing and pray, and he stands by them. This is to keep the slaves from their master, because they are not allowed to meet together, except a white man be present. At the funeral, all the slaves from the adjoining plantations obtain passes from their overseers and come. So this is really a great day for the poor blacks to see each other. If their hearts are sad, they are happy to see their friends, and they all go to some place, and their friends receive such entertainment as it is in their power to give. They stay together till night draws on, and then each leaves for his home. As soon as possible after the funeral, the slaves must go to their work. They have no person to speak a word of comfort to them, to cheer their heavy hearts, but they must go on working and mourning all the day and night. If they had someone to sympathize with them, their burden would be lightened. But no one cares for the tears of the widow, the sighs of the disconsolate husband, the sobbing cries of the mother whose little son or daughter has been taken from her. No one pities the widow's son, that his mother, who labored all her life for the slaveholder and for her son when she could get an opportunity, is gone to the grave, leaving her only one behind, to toil on yet longer beneath the lash of the tyrant overseers, and at the mercy of unfeeling slaveholders. Ah, my readers, even in the grave there is more comfort to the sad ones afflicted than in the prison house of hopeless slavery. Once, O Northern reader, visit the auction block, and all that is human within your soul will be aroused, and you will feel and know what American slavery is. End of chapters 4 and 5. Sketches of Slave Life by Peter Randolph, Chapters 6 and 7. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 6. Slaves on the Auction Block. The auctioneer is crying the slave to the highest bidder. "Gentlemen, here is a very fine boy for sale. He is worth $1,200. His name is Emmanuel. He belongs to Deacon William Harrison, who wants to sell him because his overseer don't like him. How much, gentlemen? How much for this boy? He is a fine, hardy nigger. Bid up, gentlemen. He must be sold." Some come up to look at him, pull open his mouth to examine his teeth, and see if they are good. Poor fellow! He is handled and examined like any piece of merchandise, but he must bear it. Neither tongue nor hand, nor any other member, is his own. Why should he attempt to use another's property? Again the bidder goes on. "I will give $1,000 for that boy." The auctioneer says, "Sir, he is worth $1,200 at the lowest. Bid up, gentlemen, bid up. Going. Are you all done? Once, twice, 3 times. All done? Gone." See the slaveholder who has just bought the image of God come to his victim and take possession of him. Poor Emmanuel must go away from his wife, never to see her again. All the ties of love are severed. The declaration of the Almighty, which said, "What God hath joined together, let not man put asunder," is unheeded, and he must leave all to follow his Christian master, a member of the Episcopal Church, a partaker from time to time of the Lord's Sacrament. Such men mock religion and insult God. Oh, that God would rend the heavens and appear unto these heartless men! Next comes Jenny and her 5 children. Her husband was sold and gone. The oldest of her children is a girl 17 years old. Her name is Lucy. Auctioneer: "Here, gentlemen, is a fine girl for sale. How much for her? Gentlemen, she will be a fortune for anyone who buys her who wants to raise niggers. Bid up, gentlemen, bid up. Fine girl, very hearty, good health, only 17 years old. She's worth $1,500 to anyone who wants to raise niggers. Here's her mother. She's got 9 children. The rest of them are sold. How much, gentlemen? How much? Bid up, bid up." Poor Lucy is sold away from all the loved ones, and goes to receive the worst of insults from her cruel taskmaster. Her poor mother stands by, heartbroken, with tears streaming down her face. Oh, is there a heart, not all brutish, that can witness such a scene without falling to the earth with shame, that the rights of his fellow creatures are so basely trampled upon? The seller or buyer of a human being for purposes of slavery is not human, and has no right to the name. The next article sold is Harry, a boy of 15. Auctioneer: "Gentlemen, how much for this boy? He is an honest boy, can be trusted with anything you wish. How much for him?" Harry is sold from his mother, who is standing watching for her turn. She began to scream out, "Oh, my child, my child!" Here the old slaveholder said, "Ah, my girl, if you do not stop that hollering, I will give you something to holler for." Poor Jenny, the mother, tried to suppress her grief, but all in vain. Harry was gone, and the children cried out, "Good bye, Harry, good bye." The broken-hearted mother sobbed forth, "Farewell, my boy, try to meet me in heaven." The next of the children was Mary. She was put upon the block and sold. Then the mother became so affected that she seemed like one crazy. So the old rough slaveholder went to the mother and began to lay the lash upon her, but it mattered not to her. Her little Mary was gone, and now her turn had come. O mothers who sit in your comfortable homes, surrounded by your happy children, think of the poor slave mother robbed so cruelly of her all, by a fate worse than death. Oh, think of her, pray for her, toil for her ever. Teach your blooming daughters to think with compassion of their far-off colored sisters, and train them up anti-slavery women. Teach your sons the woes and burning wrongs of slavery. Make them grow up earnest, hard-working anti-slavery men. When mothers all do this, we may hope yet to live in a free country. Wretched, childless, widowed Jenny was placed upon the block for sale. Auctioneer: "Gentlemen, here's Jenny. How much for her? She can do good work. Now, gentlemen, her master says he believes her to be a Christian, a very pious old woman, and she will keep everything straight around her. You may depend on her. She will neither lie nor steal. What she says may be believed. Just let her pray, and she will keep right." Here Jesus Christ was sold to the highest bidder, sold in Jenny to keep her honest, to bring gold to the slaveholder. Jenny was sold away from all her little children, never to see them again. Poor mother, who had toiled day and night to raise her little children, feeling all a mother's affection for them, she must see them no more in this world. She feels like mourning, like Rachel weeping for her children, and would not be comforted because they were not. So she commends them to the care of the God of the widow and the fatherless, by bathing her bosom in tears, and giving them the last affectionate embrace, with the advice to meet her in heaven. Oh, the tears of the poor slave that are in bottles, to be poured out upon his blood-stained nation as soon as the cup of wrath of the Almighty Avenger is full, when he shall say, "I have heard the groanings of my people, and I will deliver them from the oppressor." Slaveholders carry the price of blood upon their backs and in their pockets. The very bread they eat is the price of blood. The houses they live in are bought with blood. All the education they have is paid for by the blood and sorrow of the poor slaves. In parting with their friends at the auction block, the poor blacks have the anticipation of meeting them again in the heavenly Canaan, and sing, "Oh, fare you well, oh, fare you well, God bless you until we meet again. Hope to meet you in heaven, to part no more." Chorus: "Sisters, fare you well, sisters, fare you well, God Almighty bless you till we meet again." Among the slaves there is a great amount of talent, given by the hand of inspiration; talent, too, which, if cultivated, would be of great benefit to the world of mankind. If these large minds are kept sealed up, so that they cannot answer the end for which they were made, somebody must answer for it on the great day of account. Oh, think of this, my readers! Think of that day when it shall be said to all the world, "Give an account of thy stewardship." Among the slaves may be found talents which, if improved, would be instrumental in carrying the blessed gospel of truth to distant lands, and in bringing the people to acknowledge the true and living God. But all has been crushed down by a Christian world, and by the Christian Church. With these solemn facts written against this nation, see to it, my brothers, before this iniquity overthrow you, and it be too late to repent. The sin of holding slaves is not only against one nation, but against the whole world, because we are here to do one another good in treating each other well; and this is to be done by having right ideas of God and His religion. But this privilege is denied to 3.5 millions of the people of this our own free land. The slaveholders say we have not a true knowledge of religion; but the great Teacher said, when He came on His mission, "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because He hath anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He hath sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captive, and recovering of sight to the blind, and to set at liberty them that are bruised, and to preach the acceptable year of the Lord." This ought to be the work of the ministers and the churches. Anything short of this is not the true religion of Jesus. This is the great commandment of the New Testament: love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, and thy neighbor as thyself. Do unto others as ye would have they should do to you, is the golden rule for all men to follow. By this rule shall all men be judged. We have got to hear, "Come, ye blessed, depart ye cursed." These are my convictions, and my belief of the religion of Jesus, the wonderful counselor of the children of the created Adam, our great progenitor. In view of these things, I earnestly beg my readers to renew their interest in the anti-slavery cause, never turning a deaf ear to the pleadings of the poor slave, or to those who speak, however feebly, for him. The anti-slavery cause is the cause of humanity, the cause of religion, the cause of God. Chapter 7. City and Town Slaves. The slaves in the cities, Petersburg, Richmond, and Norfolk, in Virginia, do not fare so hard as on the plantations, where they have farming work to do. Most of the town and city slaves are hired out to bring in money to their owners. They often have the privilege of hiring themselves out by paying their owners so much at stated times, say once a week or once a month. Many of them are employed in factories and work at trades. They do very well, for if they are industrious they can earn considerably more than is extracted of them by their owners. All can dress well, have comfortable homes, and many can read and write. Many of them lay up money to purchase either their own freedom or that of some dear one. These slaves are not subjected to the lash as the poor creatures upon the plantations are, for their owners would feel, as every man should feel in the true sense, their dignity fallen, their nobility sullied, by raising the whip over their human property. Slavery, as seen here by the casual observer, might be supposed not to be so hard as one would imagine, after all the outcry of philanthropists who sit in their chimney corners amid the northern hills, and conjure up demoniac shapes and fiendish spirits, bearing the name of slaveholders. But slavery is slavery, wherever it is found. Dress it up as you may, in the city or on the plantation, the human being must feel that which binds him to another's will. Be the fetters of silk, or hemp, or iron, all alike warp the mind and goad the soul. The city slave may escape the evil eye and cruel lash of the overseer, but if he offend the all-important master, there is retribution for him. Hand this note to Captain Hart, of Norfolk, or Captain Thwing, of Petersburg, and well does the shrinking slave know what is to follow. These last-mentioned gentlemen give their time to, and improve their talents by, laying the lash upon the naked backs of men and women. Ah, my dear readers, take what side you will of slavery, Dr. Adams' South side, or the abolitionist's North side, there is but one side, and that is dark. Dark. You may think you see bright spots, but look at the surroundings of those spots, and you will see nothing but gloom and darkness. While toiling industriously and living with a dear family in comparative comfort and happiness, the city slave, whose lot is thought to be so easy, suddenly finds himself upon the auction block, knocked down to the highest bidder, and carried far and forever from those dearer to him than life. A beloved wife and tender helpless children are all bereft in a moment of husband, father, and protector, by a fate worse than death. And for what? To gratify some spirit of revenge, or add to the weight of the already well-filled purse of some Christian white man who professes ownership in his fellow man. Wretch! You may command for a season the bones and sinews of that brother, so infinitely your superior. But remember, that form is animated by a never-dying spirit. It will not always slumber. A God of infinite love and justice reigns over all, and beholds your unholy, inhuman traffic. Believe you, justice will triumph. The guilty shall not go unpunished on the earth. The righteous are to be recompensed, much more the wicked and the sinner. The whipping posts are the monuments of the religion and greatness of the Southern cities, though none but the basest of men officiate there. Yet they think as much of their office as a poor conceited dandy would of his, were he raised to the presidency of some great institution. Yet, with the knowledge of all these wrongs constantly thrust before the people, they wilfully shut their eyes and will not see, and thousands who walk these shores, free men, supported by word and deed, this abominable wickedness. Yes, even the ministers of our religion defend from those temples erected for the worship of the one living and true God, this domestic institution. With all their official sanctity, they enter the sacred desk dedicated to the service of a God of tender mercies, and consecrated to the work of imparting to those congregated before it the teachings of that pure and holy One, who preached deliverance to the captives and opened the eyes of the blind, who rebuked sin wherever found, among rulers or servants, in the synagogues, the halls of justice, or by the public ways, and instead of imitating their divine Master, the American clergy uphold these crying enormities of the dear people, who feed and pamper their luxurious appetites and clothe them in fine linen. Ah, my readers, I was once a slave, and was a partaker and witness of all its horrors, till I was 27 years old. I, in my ignorance, felt that I was called of God to preach His acceptable word to this downtrodden race. Through His mercy I was made a free man, and now resolve to devote my life, my all, to the spreading of the truth in regard to this great sin of our nation. And, oh, it makes my heart ache when I see and hear those men, possessed all their lives of every advantage, receiving their education at our seats of learning, stand up before the people as lights of the world and defend the slaveholder, or forever hold their peace in regard to the plague spot of slavery. What right, human or divine, can one man have to another, who like himself was created in the glorious image of our common Father and Creator? How can such men pray, "Our Father"? How can they talk about the human family and the great day of judgment which is to come? Surely, like the false prophets of old, they are deceiving the people. End of chapters 6 and 7. Sketches of Slave Life by Peter Randolph, Chapter 8. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 8. Religious Instruction. Many say the negroes receive religious education, that Sabbath worship is instituted for them as for others, and were it not for slavery, they would die in their sins; that really the institution of slavery is a benevolent missionary enterprise. Yes, they are preached to, and I will give my readers some faint glimpses of these preachers and their doctrines and practices. In Prince George County there were 2 meeting houses intended for public worship. Both were occupied by the Baptist denomination. These houses were built by William and George Harrison, brothers. Mr. G. Harrison's was built on the line of his brother's farm, that their slaves might go there on the Sabbath and receive instruction such as slaveholding ministers would give. The prominent preaching to the slaves was, "Servants, obey your masters. Do not steal or lie, for this is very wrong. Such conduct is sinning against the Holy Ghost, and is base ingratitude to your kind masters, who feed, clothe, and protect you." All gospel, my readers. It was great policy to build a church for the dear slave, and allow him the wondrous privilege of such holy instruction. Edloe's slaves sometimes obtained the consent of Harrison to listen to the Sabbath teachings so generously dealt out to his servants. Shame, shame, to take upon yourselves the name of Christ, with all that blackness of heart. I should think, when making such statements, the slaveholders would feel the rebuke of the apostle, and fall down and be carried out from the face of day, as were Ananias and Sapphira, when they betrayed the trust committed to them, or refused to bear true testimony in regard to that trust. There was another church about 14 miles from the one just mentioned. It was called Brandon's Church, and there the white Baptists worshipped. Edloe's slaves sometimes went there. The colored people had a very small place allotted them to sit in, so they used to get as near the window as they could to hear the preacher talk to his congregation. But sometimes, while the preacher was exhorting to obedience, some of those outside would be selling refreshments, cake, candy, and rum, and others would be horse racing. This was the way, my readers, the Word of God was delivered and received in Prince George County. The gospel was so mixed with slavery that the people could see no beauty in it, and feel no reverence for it. There was one Brother Shell who used to preach. One Sabbath, while exhorting the poor, impenitent, hard-hearted, ungrateful slaves, so much beloved by their masters, to repentance and prayerfulness, while entreating them to lead good lives, that they might escape the wrath of the lash to come, some of his crocodile tears overflowed his cheek, which so affected his hearers that they shouted and gave thanks to God that Brother Shell had at length felt the Spirit of the Lord in his heart, and many went away rejoicing that a heart of stone had become softened. But, my readers, Monday morning, Brother Shell was afflicted with his old malady, hardness of heart, so that he was obliged to catch one of the sisters by the throat and give her a terrible flogging. The like of this is the preaching, and these are the men that spread the gospel among the slaves. Ah, such a gospel had better be buried in oblivion, for it makes more heathens than Christians. Such preachers ought to be forbidden by the laws of the land ever to mock again at the blessed religion of Jesus, which was sent as a light to the world. Another Sunday, when Shell was expounding, very much engaged was he in his own attempts to enlighten his hearers, that there was one Jem Fulcrum became so enlightened that he fell from his seat quite a distance to the floor. Brother Shell thought he had preached unusually well so to affect Jem. So he stopped in the midst of his sermon and asked, "Is that poor Jemmy? Poor fellow!" But, my readers, he did not know the secret. Brother Jem had fallen asleep. Poor Shell did not do so much good as he thought he had, so Monday morning he gave Jem enough of his rawhide spirit to last him all the week, at least till the next Sabbath, when he could have an opportunity to preach to him. I could only think, when Shell took so much glory to himself for the effect of his preaching upon the slaves, of the man who owned colored Pompey. This slaveholder was a great fighter, as most of them are, and had prepared himself for the contest with great care, and wished to know how he looked. So he said, "Pompey, how do I look?" "Oh, massa, mighty." "What do you mean by mighty, Pompey?" "Why, massa, you look noble." "What do you mean by noble?" "Why, sar, you look just like one lion." "Why, Pompey, where have you ever seen a lion?" "I seen one down in yonder field the other day, massa." "Pompey, you foolish fellow, that was a jackass." "Was it, master? Well, you look just like him." This may seem very simple to my readers, but surely nothing more noble than a jackass, without his simplicity and innocence, can that man be, who will rise up as an advocate of this system of wrong. He who trains his dogs to hunt foxes and enjoy the hunt, or the horse race on the Sabbath, who teaches his bloodhounds to follow upon the track of the freedom-loving Negro, is not more guilty or immoral than he who stands in a northern pulpit and hunts down the flying fugitive, or urges his hearers to bind the yoke again upon the neck of the escaped bondman. He who will lisp one word in favor of a system which will send bloodhounds through the forests of Virginia, the Carolinas, Georgia, Kentucky, and all the South, chasing human beings who are seeking the inalienable rights of all men, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, possesses no heart; and that minister of religion who will do it is unworthy his trust, knows not what the gospel teaches, and had better turn to the heathen for a religion to guide him nearer the right. For the heathen in their blindness have some regard for the rights of others, and seldom will they invade the honor and virtue of their neighbors, or cause them to be torn in pieces by infuriated beasts. Mr. James L. Galtney was a Baptist preacher, and was employed by Mr. M. B. Harrison to give religious instruction to his slaves. He often used the common text, "Servants, obey your masters." He would try to make it appear that he knew what the slaves were thinking of, telling them they thought they had a right to be free, but he could tell them better, referring them to some passages of Scripture. "It is the devil," he would say, "who tells you to try and be free." And again he bid them be patient at work, warning them that it would be his duty to whip them if they appeared dissatisfied, all which would be pleasing to God. "If you run away, you will be turned out of God's church. Until you repent, return and ask God and your master's pardon." In this way he would continue to preach his slave-holding gospel. This same Galtney used to administer the Lord's Supper to the slaves. After such preaching, let no one say that the slaves have the gospel of Jesus preached to them. One of the Baptist ministers was named to be Harrison. He owned slaves, and was very cruel to them. He came to an untimely end. While he was riding out one afternoon, the report of a gun was heard, and he was found dead, his brains being blown out. It could never be found who killed him, and so he went to judgment with all his sins on his head. Mr. L. Hanner was a Christian preacher, selecting texts like the following: "The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he hath anointed me to preach deliverance to the captives. He hath sent me to bind up the brokenhearted." But Hanner was soon mobbed out of Prince George County, and had to flee for his life, and all for preaching a true gospel to colored people. I did not know of any other denomination where I lived in Virginia than the Baptists and Presbyterians. Most of the colored people and many of the poorer class of whites were Baptists. Sabbath and Religious Meetings. On the Sabbath, after doing their morning work and breakfast over, such as it was, that portion of the slaves who belong to the church ask of the overseer permission to attend meeting. If he is in the mood to grant their request, he writes them a pass, as follows: "Permit the bearer to pass and repass to this evening unmolested." Should a pass not be granted, the slave lies down and sleeps for the day, the only way to drown his sorrow and disappointment. Others of the slaves, who do not belong to the church, spend their Sabbath in playing with marbles and other games, for each other's food, etc. Some occupy the time in dancing to the music of a banjo, made out of a large gourd. This is continued till the after part of the day, when they separate and gather wood for their log cabin fires the ensuing week. Not being allowed to hold meetings on the plantation, the slaves assemble in the swamps, out of reach of the patrols. They have an understanding among themselves as to the time and place of getting together. This is often done by the first one arriving, breaking boughs from the trees, and bending them in the direction of the selected spot. Arrangements are then made for conducting the exercises. They first ask each other how they feel, the state of their minds, etc. The male members then select a certain space, in separate groups, for their division of the meeting. Preaching in order, by the brethren, then praying and singing all around, until they generally feel quite happy. The speaker usually commences by calling himself unworthy, and talks very slowly, until, feeling the Spirit, he grows excited, and in a short time there fall to the ground 20 or 30 men and women under its influence. Enlightened people call it excitement, but I wish the same was felt by everybody, so far as they are sincere. The slave forgets all his sufferings, except to remind others of the trials during the past week, exclaiming, "Thank God, I shall not live here always." Then they pass from one to another, shaking hands, and bidding each other farewell, promising, should they meet no more on earth, to strive and meet in heaven, where all is joy, happiness, and liberty. As they separate, they sing a parting hymn of praise. Sometimes the slaves meet in an old log cabin, when they find it necessary to keep a watch. If discovered, they escape if possible, but those who are caught often get whipped. Some are willing to be punished thus, for Jesus' sake. Most of the songs used in worship are composed by the slaves themselves, and describe their own sufferings. Thus: "Oh, that I had a bosom friend, to tell my secrets to, one always to depend upon in everything I do. How I do wander up and down, I seem a stranger quite undone. None to lend an ear to my complaint, no one to cheer me, though I faint." Some of the slaves sing, No more rain, no more snow, no more cowskin on my back. Then they change it by singing, Glory be to God that rules on high. In some places, if the slaves are caught praying to God, they are whipped more than if they had committed a great crime. The slaveholders will allow the slaves to dance, but do not want them to pray to God. Sometimes when a slave, on being whipped, calls upon God, he is forbidden to do so, under threat of having his throat cut or brains blown out. Oh, reader, this seems very hard, that slaves cannot call on their Maker when the case most needs it. Sometimes the poor slave takes courage to ask his master to let him pray, and is driven away with the answer that if discovered praying, his back will pay the bill. End of chapter 8. Sketches of Slave Life by Peter Randolph, chapters 9, 10, 11, and 12. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 9, Severing of Family Ties. At one time, Mr. George Harrison employed a vessel to take some of his slaves down the river, as he wished to sell them. The vessel came and anchored off his farm, as an armed fleet would go to make war upon an enemy's country. While this vessel was steering off the shore, the very waves seemed to speak forth in sorrow and mourning to the dreading slave. Not one word of warning was given them until the vessel was anchored to receive its living freight. Husbands were thrust on board, leaving their wives behind. Wives were torn from the arms which should have protected them, and hurried into that living grave. Children were torn shrieking from their parents, never to see them more. Tender maidens were dragged from the manly arms which loved them. The ardent lover was scoffingly compelled to break from the entwining arms of his loved one, and bid a final adieu to all the world held dear to his heart. O ye defenders of slavery, tarry here, place yourselves here in the situation of these miserable beings. Pro-slavery men and women, for one moment only, in imagination, stand surrounded by your loved ones, and behold them, one by one, torn from your grasp, or you rudely and forcibly carried from them. How, think you, would you bear it? Would you not rejoice if one voice even were raised in your behalf? Were your wife, the partner of your bosom, the mother of your babes, thus ruthlessly snatched from you, were your beloved children stolen before your eyes, would you not think it sufficient cause for a nation's wail? Yea, and a nation's interference. What better are you than those poor downtrodden children of humanity? With them such scenes are constantly transpiring. Mothers, while fondling your darling babies in your arms, and watching with the eye of a mother's affection their little mental dawnings, do you ever think of the poor slave mother, who, with equal affection, looks upon her offspring, yet with a heart full of agony prays God to take it to himself before the evil day comes when it must be goaded and lashed, and then forbidden every consolation of affection? Oh, think of her, pray for her, toil for her. Fathers, you who stand before your fellow men and uphold this hellish institution, while your blooming daughters are before you, look at them and think. In your own land are thousands of daughters as lovely, as much beloved as yours, whose parents cannot protect them, whose parents cannot say, "My daughter, beware of the tempter's snare. My daughter, fly to these arms for protection. My daughter, pour out your sorrows upon your mother's bosom. Into her listening ear tell your tale of wrongs. She will guide, she will comfort you." No, but they must look tamely on and witness their degradation. They must behold them become the spoiler's prey, and presume not to utter one word in their behalf. Why? They are slaves, the property of free-born American citizens. And why should we infringe upon their rights? Ah, Father, could you see your daughter in such a situation and not cry aloud for vengeance? And what better are you than the poor slave, whose only sin is that his skin is perhaps one shade darker than yours, perhaps not even that? Young man, will you defend slavery? Will you cast your vote for a slaveholder? Think before you speak. Consider well before you act. Could you have that fair young being you one day hope to call your wife torn from you and publicly sold to the service of a debauchee? Would you think it too much to call on the laws of the land for redress? Would you think it asking too much to call out the whole military force of the country to the rescue? Ah, no! And would you restrain yourselves and behold the loved forms of your aged parents reeking with their own blood, drawn forth by one who calls himself their master? Indeed, no. No dungeon deep and loathsome enough for such an one, no gibbet too high to swing him on, as an example to all his kind. And what better are your loved ones than those millions of colored, suffering brothers and sisters? Ask no more, why meddle with slavery? As you would receive assistance, give it to others. The vessel to which I have alluded, anchored by Harrison's estate, was made ready to sail on Sunday, that all might witness her departure. Imagination cannot conceive, nor language describe, those parting scenes. When all were on board, a dead silence reigned. No sound except the harsh voice of the captain as he gave his orders, and the coarse jests of the sailors, was heard. Slowly the vessel crept along the shore, like some guilty thing trying to hide itself from the light of day. Then pealed forth upon the Sabbath air a cry of woe that rent the heavens, and was registered there: "Good-bye, my husband. Farewell, my wife. Good-bye, children. We must hope to meet in heaven." With shouts like these they gazed upon each other as long as the vessel was in sight. Then, indeed, all was over. Gone, gone forever, or left behind, going farther and farther from the loved ones. These were the cruel reflections. Some returned to their deserted cabins, not one loved one to meet. Some fathers drew around them their little ones bereft of a mother's love. Wives sat and wept alone. Children wandered about without parents or any one to love them. O men with hearts, how can you be unconcerned and careless regarding this curse of your country? O my readers, I wish you could enter into my feelings, or rather that my feelings might enter into your souls on this subject. God, in his infinite wisdom, created the Ethiopian race with skins of a darker hue than the European. He did so with an all-wise purpose, but was that purpose that they might be subjects of every outrage from their fellow men, from generation to generation? Oh, surely not! What crime can it be to be born with a dark skin? Who is responsible? The Creator alone. But who are responsible for the crimes perpetrated against them? The slaveholder and his supporters. This scene of separation upon the James River, where all the tenderest ties of the human heart were sundered, was but one among the very many which daily occur. Go with the poor bereaved ones the next morning, as they arise from their disturbed slumbers to commence the day of toil. The sight of the Master is gall to their wounded spirits. They look not upon the overseer except with absolute horror. But if they falter, they must feel the lash. Even the little crouching, grieving children are forbidden to weep for their dear parents. The lash, the curse, are their only consolations, except when they can crawl by themselves and pour out their woes into the sympathizing ear of Jesus, their great Comforter. My father was living at the time these slaves of Harrison were sold. He was one of his drivers, so he was not sold with them. But he had two brothers who were, and with a heavy heart he had to witness their departure, without daring to say his soul was his own. Monday he must return to his disgraceful business of whipping his brothers. But what could he do? He must obey his master, or suffer a worse penalty than he could inflict upon others. Some may say, while sitting comfortably among their dear friends, "We would die before we would be guilty of beating, at the command of another, our own kinsmen, perhaps our own children." Ah, it is easy to suppose and assert what you would do while you are safe, but you are not a slave. Your feelings of generous affection may well take deep root, shoot upward and flourish. They are never harrowed up by the sight of tortures you are unable to prevent, never trodden upon and crushed into the dust. You may boast of your manly courage and your willingness to die. It may be the poor slave driver would crave the privilege of dying for his loved ones, but would it profit those left behind, so long as the lash and a white overseer remained? No, no. Hands without a heart might use it. There would be no escape. Many say the slave on the Southern plantation is the happiest creature alive. They don't know. They don't lift the cover. They don't see them always. I have seen many a white man carry a smiling face to the world when his heart was aching and cankering in wretchedness. I have heard a merry laugh from a maniac whose brain had been crazed by mental anguish. But I never supposed he was happy. And I have told you, in another place, how these slaves are prepared by rum for company and spectators. Chapter 10. Colored Drivers. The colored overseers are not over the slaves because they wish it, but are so placed against their will. When they first commence to lash the backs of their fellows, they are like soldiers when they first go to the battlefield. They dread and fear the contest until they hear the roaring of the cannon and smell the powder and mark the whizzing ball. Then they rush into the battle, forgetful of all human sympathy while in fight. So it is with the slave drivers. They hear the angry tones of the slaveholder's voice admonishing them that if they refuse to whip, they must take it themselves. After receiving the instructions of their owners, they must forget even their own wives and children, and do all they can for master. If they do not do this, they must receive all that would be given the others. In this manner their hearts and consciences are hardened, and they become educated to whipping, and lose all human feeling. This is the way the slaveholders take to hide their own wickedness. They say the colored driver is more cruel than the white overseer, and use this as an argument against the poor colored man, to show how cruelly they would treat each other if they had the power. Pardon me, my readers, if I say this is an insult to God, since my own experience teaches me better. Reader, when they say that colored drivers are worse than white, the question may well be asked, why is this? Is it the fault of the colored people, or is it the fault of the white man? Good sense answers to every thinking mind, and says the poor Negro is not the greatest transgressor here, but the white men are the tyrannical instigators of this wrong. I have known many instances where slaves were put to death by the overseers without any notice being taken of it by those who administer the laws. Of course, as the word of a black man is not received against a white, nothing could be effected, even if the murderer were arrested. I will give a few cases that came within my own knowledge. James Lewis was shot down by an overseer and killed. Dick Never was shot down by Owen Woodcock and killed. Ham was shot by Bishop and killed. A woman was shot dead by her overseer, Hobbs. Wyatt Lee was shot, but not killed. William Painting was shot. These, my readers, are facts which will speak for themselves when the great day of reckoning shall come. And those black-hearted sinners will surely be punished, for no sinners escape finally. If the laws of Virginia and other slave-holding states allow them to go unscathed, the eternal laws of justice and right will not. Chapter 11. Mental Capacity of the Slave. Much is said about the inability of the slaves to learn anything but drudgery, that they are fit for nothing else, that those who have ever shown any intellectual power are of mixed blood, not the pure African. This I deny, and I will prove that the African is capable of the highest culture. As a people, how can they be expected to have enlightened minds when they are denied every privilege of learning? They never have teachers, books are not within their reach. Surely they would be wonderful beings if, amid all their hardships and privations, they could show themselves scholars. Their ideas of God, heaven, and religion are very simple and childlike, but they are the conceptions of their own uninstructed minds. The world sees in the person of Frederick Douglass what the son of Ethiopia may become. He had no advantages in his youth, but now, before he is old, his fame as an orator has spread over this land. extended itself across the Atlantic and carried him to the shores of the Old World, where his eloquence, intelligence, and worth gained for him and family a name which will adorn the pages of history long after his voice is hushed in death. Had Douglas been educated in youth, there is not a statesman on this continent who would have stood above him. Then there is Rev. Samuel R. Ward, an unmixed African, who has made great proficiency in learning. His powers as a public speaker are truly captivating, and so ably does he write and speak that even his enemies acknowledge him to be a man of uncommon power. There is also Rev. Henry Highland Garnet, a son of the same race. He is a scholar, a gentleman, and an orator, as all who have seen and heard him admit. These men are but few out of many, and they prove to the world that the Negro is as capable of high intellectual culture as his Saxon brother. It must be acknowledged by every historian that Ethiopia was once the most civilized nation upon earth, and that the enlightened nations of the present day are indebted to her for many of the arts of civilization. The people of that country were the first to work in brass, iron, and other metals, and were really the first to invent writing, for they used hieroglyphics to express words and ideas, which no other nation had then done. Let it not be said, then, that the Negro cannot be educated. Free the slaves, give them equal opportunities with the whites, and I warrant you they will not fall short in comparison. I do protest against this great evil of slavery in this civilized land of America, and solemnly appeal to those having authority in behalf of 3.5 millions of my suffering brethren who are held by the galling yoke of bondage, that this great evil may be done away before the retributions of a God of justice overtake this blackest of sins and scathe the sinner root and branch. I appeal to the Christian Church to lift up its voice that it may be heard from shore to shore in defense of the oppressed. I appeal to the men of America everywhere to help this cause. I appeal to the women of America that they plead for their suffering sisters, toiling and weeping under cruel taskmasters in the sunny South. I appeal to little children that they remember in their prayers those little colored brothers and sisters who are robbed of their parents, have no homes for their weary little frames, no affection to make life lovely to them, no one to teach them and guide them to the fountain of all truth. I appeal to high heaven to listen to the heartbreaking cries of the captive Negro, and pray the great Jehovah to soften the hard hearts of the many Pharaohs, that they may let the people go free. Chapter 12. The Blood of the Slave. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the ground, and it calls loudly for vengeance on his adversaries. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the rice swamps. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the cotton plantations. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the tobacco farms. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the sugar fields. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the cornfields. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the whipping post. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the auction block. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the gallows. The blood of the slave cries unto God from the hunting dogs that run down the poor fugitive. The blood of men, women, and babes cries unto God from Texas to Maine. Wherever the fugitive slave law reaches, the voice of its victims is heard. The mighty God, the great Jehovah, speaks to the consciences of men and says, "Let my people go free." And the slaveholder answers, "Who is Jehovah, that I should obey him?" Then the anti-slavery voice is heard calling, "Awake, awake, and cry aloud against this great evil. Lift up your voice like a trumpet, and show the people their sins and the nation its guilt. Pray that God may have mercy upon us. Oh, forgive us this great evil, the evil of selling, whipping, and killing men, women, and children. O God of justice, give us hearts and consciences to feel the deep sorrow of this great evil that we have so long indulged in. Lo, we have sinned against heaven, we have sinned against light, against the civilized world. We have sinned against that declaration which our fathers put forth to the world. All men were created equal. O God, forgive us this great sin. O let this prayer be heard. Where is Thy Brother? By Mrs. E. L. Follen. What mean ye that ye bruise and bind My people, saith the Lord, and starve your craving brother's mind, who asks to hear My word? What mean ye, that ye make them toil through long and hopeless years, and shed like rain upon your soil their blood and bitter tears? What mean ye, that ye dare to rend the tender mother's heart? Brother from sister, friend from friend, how dare ye bid them part? What mean ye, when God's bounteous hand to you so much has given, that from the slave that tills your land ye keep both earth and heaven? When at the judgment God shall call, Where is thy brother? Say. What mean ye to the Judge of all, to answer on that day? End of chapter 12. End of From Slave Cabin to Pulpit and Sketches of Slave Life by Peter Randolph.